Welcome to today's live code. So today the plan is to hopefully complete the interest credit calculation. The plan for today is to finish off this calculate interest credit story. So where we were was we had figured out the heuristics and came up with a couple of sort of given, when, then type of examples. And so, as I mentioned last time, specification by example and behavior-driven development is sort of the strategy we're following here. So the overall idea is that we want, once a month, we want interest to be credited based on the balance at the end of last month. Which I just realized, so there's a, okay, so I need to write down another case to handle. Th this stuff is surprisingly complicated. You think, like when I first thought about this, like, oh, this won't be too hard. So one thing that we need to keep in mind is that the interest credit, say, as of, let's say February 1st, 2019, which actually turns out to be tomorrow, it's as of that date, even if we calculate it on, February 25th. And so we don't have any good stories for that. So we'll have to handle that situation. And again, this is why you want to have lots of good examples, lots of good concrete specific situations to help make sure that you have good coverage of the feature. So let's go through, and incidentally, we'll see when we think about the solution to this, the way we've structured our transactions and figuring out the balance, we can actually figure out a point in time balance. So we can say, as of this date, what were all the transactions, even if there are later transactions that happened. And so that's really kind of nice about a nice thing that falls out of the design that we have. All right, so let's go look at the tests we have. Actually, let's look at the stories here. So what I've done is I've put all these together, and this one we're handling, so interest should only be deposited once for current month. So if today is February 1st, the last interest credited was already done on February 1st. When we request the balance, which is the trigger for checking to see if there needs to be interest credited, then we don't add any additional credit. So we have a test for that. And that's this one here. And so what we're saying is on this date, we start out with there being money already in the account. We request the balance. This should trigger the initial interest credit for that date. When we ask for it again, we don't want it to do another credit for the same date. So we want to be sure that not only is there only one transaction matching this date, there's also basically only one transaction on that date that's an interest credit, or the other way around is for all of the interest credit transactions, there's only one on this particular date. Let me go back to my story here and change the dates, because I want them to be, these are the specific examples, and I'd want somebody to look at this and be able to then immediately see that it was implemented with this test so that the dates actually match. And balance and account balance is $100. So that way we're really clear that this is pretty readable, and then if we look at the implementation, we can see how that maps. So if we run these tests, both of these should pass. Both. I meant all three. So we've got that one. The other one that we've implemented from this list is If there's a month credit missing, so basically if today is March 1st and no interest was ever credited, then we should only add a single credit. That should be 3-1, right? So if we go to the story, and again, let's match up these dates. So given today is 2/1 of 2019. So let's make that match here. And it's important to, I was a little bit lazy about leaving out the year, but putting in the year is really important, especially as we cross over years. So here, if today is the 1st of February, the last interest credited. So when we phrased it this way, this is actually a different test. So let's take a look at these. This one is where there's $100 in the account and today is the 1st, and there was already interest credited for today, then we don't add any credit. Missing 1 month, so there's a separate situation where the no interest was ever credited. So let's pull this out into a separate story where it's, so we'll have to do this one. So given today is let's say 3/1/2019, and account balance is 100, and no interest was ever credited. So there are 0 interest credited transactions. When we request balance, right, on 3/1/2019, then we add credit only for, and so now the question is what date would we expect, right? So today is the 1st of March, we're asking for the balance, there's already $100, when do we start calculating interest? And as we discovered last time, we'd have to look at what was the last transaction, or actually what was the first transaction. So the account balance is 100 and first transaction was, let's say it was 2/3/2019. So now the situation is basically the first transaction was on February 3rd. We don't want to calculate interest for January because the account sort of didn't exist in January. The account only existed in February. And so in February, we basically, when we request the balance, then we add credit only for March 1st, 2019. So we need to handle that situation where no interest was ever credited. This one is, if we're going to match it up against this story, then there was an interest credit on 1/1/19. So, and last interest credit was on 1/1/19. Today is 2/1. Then when we request balance on 2/1, we only add credit for 2/1. And we saw that the test passed, so let's look at this again. So basically today is February 1st. There was an initial deposit of February 27th. This kind of makes no sense. Oh, sorry, but this is 2018. Let's change this to make it more clear that these dates are in a row. So we have an initial deposit. We have already credited interest on the 1st. So what we expect is that now, if today is February 1st, then we expect there to be a single transaction that's an interest credit, and we expect to find it. Now, we don't have to do additional testing here to say, oh, was there only one? Because we're only requesting balance for once. And the other thing is that we already have a test to make sure that there's only one. So we don't want to put too many assertions into a single test. Okay, so going back to here, we want a test that so actually that's this test. So, all right, so let's make sure that the one we just talked about. All right, so 2119, last interest credit was on that. When we request balance. Yeah, so this is that test. Okay, so we've actually done this. I like the way this is phrased a bit better, so I'm gonna sort of merge these. And so now we have this test implemented. Good. I thought I had actually too many tests here. And now what we want to do is, so we've got this one works. Current month equals 2, most recent credit month equals 1. So that's referencing this heuristic, right? The overall idea of interest credit is we generate credits from whatever the most recent credit month year is plus 1 through the current month year where the day is equal to 1. Right, so in this example, the most recent credit month is January of 2019, so the month is 1, and we'll add the year, right, so 1 of 2019. When we request the balance on February 1st, then it's basically 1 plus 1 through 2, right, so this is the current month, year, and so the idea is basically this plus 1 month through this. Right, so January 2019 plus 1 month is February. February through February is 1 month, and so we should get a single credit. Now this one is pretty much the same thing, except when we're when we're requesting the balance, it's actually the second. And so basically it's the same thing, except this date doesn't matter. In fact, let's make it something like the 25th, or even like, 27th. And so the result should be there should still be only a credit for, or only for this date. Right, so these two are very similar. The only difference is when are we doing the balance request. So if the last interest was 1-1, then the next interest should be 2-1. So let's go and implement that test. So basically duplicate this test. So here we're saying it should add the credit even if today is not the first of the month. So given today is the 27th, is that what we said? Yeah, we said 27th. And let's copy this test name so we can keep track. So given today is the 27th, and we'll rename this. And here's our initial deposit. We can vary this amount just to be different. We can vary this amount just to be different. Last interest credit. So we're basically saying today's the 27th of February. The last interest credit was January 1st when we request the balance. We still expect the same thing. Right? We basically expect that there's a transaction on February 1st for interest credit. So if we run all the tests, the interest credit tests, interesting. So this one failed. And so looks like there's a sensitivity to the starting date. So that's good. That means we need to go implement something in our account balance. Good. Okay. So what this is showing is previously when we were doing the interest credit, we were assuming that the date of the interest credit was basically now. However, it's not. It should be sort of coerced to the first day of the current month. So what we should do is say local date time interest credit date time, and so that should be coerced to first of current month. So we can take that, put that as interest credit date time, put that in here, and so now we want a method that given a local date time returns local date time dot let's see, with day of month as 1. That was easier than I expected. Maybe it's not worth. I think that's actually pretty straightforward. I'm going to actually inline it. Usually I'll pull out stuff into methods if there's something that makes it hard to figure out what it's doing. But here, this is actually pretty straightforward. It's basically saying now with day of month 1, but I'm getting the urge to write a comment here to say we're coercing to day 1 because interest only gets credited on the first day. I feel like even though that this is pretty readable, this is a little bit more indicative of what I'm trying to do. So if I'm sort of comparing the two names, this is slightly better. And then I can put basically a comment here as to why. Right, so we're coercing interest is always credited as of the first of the month. Okay, so now that should make this test pass and all these others should still pass. Yep. Good. So now Okay, so we'll need, oops, let's go to, all right, so this one's working, this one's working, this one's working, this one. So we sort of have two situations left to cover. We've got one situation where we have a whole bunch of basically sort of, so far we've only been crediting 1 month, but now what if we have multiple ones? This one's a bit of overkill. This one crosses years, so I want to save that. I want a slightly shorter one. Let's say given today is March 28th, on request balance on March 28th, the last interest credited, let's put this as 10/1/2018. Reason why is I don't want to have to check so many, because really all we're, when I'm thinking about testing, one of the most important things you want to think about in terms of testing is testing boundary conditions. And so the boundary I'm concerned about here is crossing over the year, right? Crossing from 2018 to 2019. So I don't need to go so deep into 2018. That just makes the test longer. In fact, I could change this to 11, and then we're basically saying we want 11/1, 2018, 12/1, 2018, 1/1, 2019, and then 2/1, 2019. Okay, so we have this one where we not only have multiple, but we're crossing the year boundary. So multiple sort of retroactive credit plus crossing a year boundary. This one is just that there's multiple ones. No, sorry, this one is where no interest has ever been credited. So the question is, do we need a test that just tests multiple? I kind of feel like this captures it sufficiently. We don't need to go nuts. But these are still two different situations. This one is retroactive credit, no previous credits. And let's say today is March 10th. There we go. Okay, so this one still results in a single credit. Try to decide, do I do the single credit first or the crossing the boundary first? This one will force us to figure out some kind of loop. This one will have a, sort of a default fallback if there are no transactions. Let's do this one first. So copy that. And we'll have a test. So, oops. Copy this here. I'm putting these as comments because this will guide how we're going to write our test. And so now, so this one is retroactive credit should only be created as of first account transaction. Right, so we don't go further back behind the first account transaction. That's our goal for this test. Let's go and say the test is this. Okay, so given today is March 10th, move that window. All right, so we're going to create the clock for today. I generally don't like to do lots of copying and pasting in tests because it's very easy to accidentally copy something and forget to change something, and then tests become harder to read. So here we've got 2019 310. The account balance is 100. So we need to create an account. New. And the new account takes a new fake transaction repository. And then our clock. And then we want to deposit into that. Oops. So I should assign that to a variable. And now I can say account deposit local date time midnight of. So we'll say that the first transaction here tells us the first transaction was 2/3/2019. So 2019 2/3 depositing $100, which is 10,000 cents. Initial deposit. Okay. And no interest was ever credited, so basically we don't need to this is a no op. So now when we request the balance, right, and we know this is the date because this is our clock that's in effect, the one that's 2019-03-10 that we created up here. So if we do account.balance, we actually don't care what the balance is, then there should only be a credit for 3/1 of 2019. So what we can do is we can say, so on the account transactions, we can stream that. And on that stream, we can filter for only interest credits. And a couple of ways we can check. We can basically, we can do a count and make sure there's only one. Or we could be specific and we can say that we could do a similar any match, basically say there's let's see, so if we do it this way, this tells us that there's only one, but it doesn't tell us what the date is. That might be enough. Because if there's more than one, then clearly something went wrong. But maybe we should check the date. So it's basically similar to this. So we can do any match. Just thinking of all the scenarios where if there's more than one, well, let's do that. So basically, any match, and the date we're talking about is local date time at midnight of 2019 3/1. And let's assign that to a variable of found. I'm trying to decide whether I want to refactor this into a variable like I did here. Kind of feel like this is good. This is good enough. Maybe I'll inline this one because I think then I won't have to pull out transactions separately. Let's do that. And then I can inline this. Yeah, that's better. Okay, So basically now we want to just assert that found is true. And let's run all our tests. Do I expect this one to fail? Nope. That's interesting. I wasn't quite sure if it should fail. Um, right, it doesn't matter because we're only doing a single retroactive credit. It's not until we do multiple ones where there's going to be some loop and there's going to have to be a starting point for that loop to see where um, uh, sort of where it starts and where it ends. So this test passes for now, but this test might fail later once we start implementing the multiple transactions, which is where we are. Oops. So let's So I'm just updating this comment where it was for interest credit calculated as of 219, calculated on must use balance as of 2/1. Okay, so now we want to do the last big thing, which is, so today is March 28th. The last interest credit was on 11/1. When we request balance, we expect it to fill in fact, all of them through March 1st. Right, so we basically, the last interest credited was here. Oh, so if the last interest credited was here, actually we don't want one, right? Because it's sort of exclusive on this end. Right, so we basically, there's already one for this, so the next one is going to be December 1st, January 1st of the following year for, in that case, we're already crossing the boundary quite a bit. Let's just reduce the number of transactions to by 1, since that doesn't really matter. Okay, so here we're crossing the year boundary, we're doing retroactive credit. We're actually doing multiple retroactive credit plus crossing the year boundary. Now that I think about this, maybe this is too big of a jump. Maybe not. Let's yeah, I'm just thinking whether this is going to be, because we're going to have to basically generate a sequence of some sort for these dates. Maybe that's just straightforward. Let's go that way. Okay, so we'll copy this, go back to our interest credit test. And so I'm not sure what to call this just yet. So let's comment these out. So given today is 228, so months without credits should fill in credits retroactively. Not the best name ever, but we'll go with it. Okay, so given today is that, so we'll need a clock of 2019-02-28 equals clock for 2019-02-28. Yeah, don't do 02 because that's octal. Yeah, don't do that. Not that would matter for 0, 2, but okay. And then we want to create an account. So account, new, and it takes a fake repository, new, and it takes the clock. Okay, and then we want to have I wonder if we need a deposit at all, because we should have it. So we're going to need a deposit and an interest credit, so that's basically something like this. And we want to make sure that there's a problem with copying and pasting. So 2018 11/1, so that means we need to make the deposit before that, so we'll make it October 27th. And let's put that at, so, and initial and account has $200 balance. And the last interest credited on November 1st of 2018. So now when we request the balance, and this is 2/28/2019, right, which was the clock we created up here, then there should be 3 interest credits, right? The catch-up ones from December, January, and February. So we expect that if we do account transactions stream, and we filter for the initial interest credit, that's this thing. Oh, maybe I should have done this before. Because what we can do is we can actually do a map. So we can say, I don't care about the amounts because we're not testing the amounts, we're just seeing what the dates are. So we can do is we can do a map and we can pull out the date time. And then it basically should match a, yeah. So now out of that, let's assign that to a variable, and that's going to be basically, no, I don't want a stream, so I need to do list collect. So I want this one. Technically, I could collect it to a set, but and then assign it to a variable. Okay, so now I've got interest credit date times. All right, so basically what I've done here is I've gotten the transactions as a stream. I've filtered out so all that we're getting are the interest credit ones. We've mapped it because we don't want the transactions, we just want the date time of the transaction. And then we collect it to a list. Oh, that's okay. So what I was wondering is, IntelliJ will tell you sort of what is coming out of each line of the stream operations, but I guess it only did that if stream was on a line on its own. Okay, well, if it's going to do that, then I want to do that all the time because that's super useful when you're sort of scanning the code. Yeah. Now, what I've also found is that it only does that if there's more than, I think, 3. I haven't figured out how to change that. So here, let's just, like, since we're doing that, let's just inline this. We're not using that thing elsewhere. So now we get, because we've got multiple lines. And put that one on a new line and inline it. And then fix up the indentation. Okay. So we are here. So what this is telling us is out of account transactions, this gives us this immutable set of transaction. And then from that, we get a stream of transactions. And we filter, we're still getting a stream of transactions because we're just basically only passing on the ones that are match this predicate. This is interest credit predicate. And then we're mapping it, so now it's a bunch of local date times, and then we collect it to a list. We collect it to a list because now we can use a search awesome, hello, and now we can say it contains, I don't think we care about order, we just want to say it contains exactly in any order. And what we want is we want local date time as of midnight of 2018, 12/1. So let's move this comment down here because that's where we're actually checking it. Well, okay, so technically we added this interest credit manually, so when we get the interest credits, this one will be included. So we can either put it part of here, or we can say that we can actually do another filter where the date is basically more than a certain time, but I'm actually going to say that this is part of it. So we should have this one, right, the one that we added manually, and then this one, and then 2019 1/1, and then 2019 2/1. Right, so what we're saying is, in addition to the ones that should have been added, these are the ones that, all the ones that we should have. So this test will definitely fail because we haven't done anything with multiple interest credits. Yep. So we're expecting this, but really we ended up with 2, right? Because we had the original one that we added manually in the test, and then it just added 1 for the current month, which is February. And so now we need to do the work of basically filling in the gap here. So now's a good time for a break. So I'm going to take a short break, and when we come back, we will make this test pass. All right, and we're back. And so again, where we left off was we need to fill in the retroactive credits. So if we go to our account where we're doing credit interest as needed, currently we basically just sum up the balance up to today and then create an interest credit. So this isn't good enough. So what's interesting is we currently have this method should credit interest, which looks to see if we have or have not credited interest for the current month. I think this is going to go away because what we want to do is we don't really care if interest was credited for the current month or not. We want to basically generate a month year sequence of interest to be credited. So I think what we need is something like, let's delete this if statement. And it's going to basically be, so it's going to be, we're going to have something like this. We're going to get month year dates for credit, for retroactive credits. And then for each month year, create interest credit for for balance as of that month, as of the first of that month here. So what it looks like would be useful to have, and I think this is useful anyway, is to say what was the balance as of a certain date. So right, so we have two parts, and the second part is going to use that thing. So we'll get to writing tests for that. So what we want to do is we want to get month year dates for retroactive credits. So in order to do that, we need to find out what is the what is basically what's the most recent interest credit date. So for finding the most recent interest credit date, well, we know how to do that. Once we have that, then we can loop from recent interest credit date to first of current clock's month. Okay, so what we can do here is the most recent interest credit date is actually really straightforward because we have our transactions and we can stream those. And if we make sure that they are, we'll filter them first by interest, is interest credit. And then we can sort those and we do that already. Where did we do that? So sorted. Oh, we did that. Did we do that in a test? Seem to remember doing a sorted. Ah, we did it when, oh, because we sort when we were turning the balances to the UI. Okay, well, we'll copy that. We could sort of, now this is going to, find first. Can replace with min. Really? Find first can be replaced with min? I guess they do the same thing. Okay. What I'm not sure about is in what order is comparing these gonna result in. I believe that it will be the newest first, but I kind of don't remember. So let's write a test for this because I actually don't remember what this is. Go here. Now the test I'm writing here is not a real test for the application. It's like, do I understand what this thing does? So this is basically a temporary test. So if we do that, we'll create list of transaction. And then we'll basically add transaction, create interest credit. So we'll create one on, actually we'll just sort of copy these. And then we'll copy this and copy this. And all these need an amount, so it doesn't really matter. Why do I have so many parentheses here? Oh, I don't know why. Oh, because I don't have enough here. That's why. Okay. And okay. So now we have 3 transactions. And what we want to do is we want to do find first. Oh, heck, let's replace with min. Oh, interesting. Okay, so min can actually take the sorting mechanism. I didn't know that. And what we want to assert is that first is present, right? So that there is one, which would be odd if there wasn't. And then we want to say that it contains, because in a sense an optional is like a mini collection. It either has nothing in it or has one item in it. So we expect that there's an item in it, and we expect that it contains this transaction. Sorry, we want the first one. Actually, what are we trying to do? We are trying to get the latest one. So let's rename this to be latest, most recent transaction. Okay. Right. So we want the most recent transaction to be this one. So let's pull this out and say this is the most recent transaction. In a sense, these didn't, actually let's say this is the transaction of 2019-0201. Okay. I should have done a rename. Okay. These didn't have to be interest credits. It really doesn't matter because all we're doing is paying attention to the daytime. But since we're filtering on credit, may as well do that. And again, this test is a temporary test that we're just using to get in my mind straight that this is going to do the right thing. I don't need to write a test for min. That comes with a JDK. I don't need to write a test for comparing. I just need to make sure that what's my mental model matches the actual functionality. So we'll just run this test by itself, and it'll either pass or fail whether we understand it correctly or not. I think that's going to need to be max. Yeah. So, and actually it makes more sense, like using the sorted and then saying find first or find last. Really, actually what we want to do is we actually want to find, give us the maximum, right, the latest date time. Oh, that's much easier to read. Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. And that's why this process is useful. It's like, I haven't done a lot with streams and date times and using max, and so this is sort of good getting that in your head. Once I have this though, I can basically take this out and then delete the test because I don't need it anymore. And that part is important, deleting the test, because I've seen code bases where the sort of playing around, making sure stuff works remains, and then you upgrade the library and something changes, which you want to have tests for, but that's a separate story. But it's like, it shouldn't be mixed in with the functional stuff. So really what we want is this. stream the transactions, filter for interest credit, and then just get the max. So this is the most recent one. Great. So now we want to basically, and we know this works because we have a test, but there's no reason to write a test for this. The only thing I might do is basically pull this out into a method. And the reason why is I want to give it a name, because most recent transaction is useful, but from the context of loop from recent of this looping where we're generating a sequence, it's actually going to be the we want to actually figure out the first date. So let's pull this into a method, calculate most recent and we don't care about the transaction, we just want the date time. Not object, darn it. So in order to refactor this so I get what I want, I actually need to do I guess I could do a map here. And then this is just max, right? But it needs parameter, it needs a comparator. So it needs the comparator what is this not liking? Oh. There we go. Right, because actually what we want is we want the most recent date time. So we may as well map to it and then basically just get a bunch of date times and then find what is the max of it. Okay, so now let's pull this into a method, and we want this to return eventually we want this to return a local date time. So let's pull that out. Local date time, most recent transaction, date time, was most recent transaction, get. And yes, I know we should be checking for whether that is null or present, but we will we'll do that as part of this method. So I don't need to say calculate, we can just say most recent interest credit date time, refactor that. That didn't actually return it. So we'll say return, make that return it. Okay, so now we want to generate a sequence, and basically this thing is going to be the end point of the sequence. So local date time, whoops, actually I don't need that. I can just paste this, and this is now last credit date time. Not happy with these variable names. So this gives us the most recent one, right? So if there's January, February, March, and currently it's May, March is the latest one. And so we basically want to do basically plus 1 month here when we loop through it. So we can basically say local, I'm not sure I want to continue using local date times because we're going to have to manufacture first of month, but we'll do this. So first credit date time equals the most recent transaction date time plus 1 month. Right, so this gives us the last one that existed. We want to say +1. And then we're going to loop from that to this one, which is basically the first of the current month. So now we want to, I have no idea if we can loop through date times. That would be interesting. Because now what we got to do is we got to figure out how do we create a stream of dates. We're going to be manufacturing dates. So I wonder if, yeah, so maybe we need to get out of the this local date time and into something that is easier to work with. So there is month, year, there is, or year, there's a year month. So what does that look like? I haven't actually used that in a long time. So it's basically a year month, it's an immutable datetime object. It's a value-based class. So it's comparable. So first, let's say first credit date time. Is there a way to just get the month value? Is there a way to convert, let's say, year, month? Yeah, so we can get that from the first credit date time. Does that help us though? Because what we want to do is we want to generate a series of these. And is there a plus? So we can do a plus month inside of a loop. And presumably that's going to return a copy, and if we wrap around the year, that should just work. So I think we're just going to have to do a good old-fashioned for loop. Actually, we could do a while loop, right? We don't need to actually do a for because we don't care about the index. What we want to do is we want to say, starting at this one, keep incrementing until we're past this one. And it would be really interesting to look at something that is a generator or basically something that can create a stream of date times, and then we could operate on that, but we don't have that. Okay, so we're going to do while, and since we're working, so first credit date time, so we actually don't, whoops, oops, sorry, didn't want to jump into implementation of local date time. So year month is interesting, but we don't really need to use it because we're eventually going to use local date times anyway for creating our transactions, and they already are set up properly. We're just going to increment the month, and it should just work fine. So basically, we want to say while. So we'll say So while credit date time is before the last, so this variable name's not great. It's not last is sort of weird. Really, it's the last date time for credit. Okay, last date time for credit. So basically, we're going to use this, and this will sort of be the thing we're going to increment. Credit interest for, and we'll give it the date. Right, and then increment it. So credit date time equals credit date time dot plus months of 1. And so this part actually now becomes this method, this credit interest for. So it takes that, and this date becomes this variable. So this is going to be wrong because this is summing up the entire set of transactions. Really, it's going to need to be a point in time. It's going to need to do it as of this date, but we'll leave it for right now and let it failing test tell us that we need to fix this. So we have, this will credit the interest for this date. So it'll figure out the balance, calculate the interest based on that balance, and then create an interest credit transaction. This will loop through from the most recent date time, loop through, continue looping while it's before. If this happens to be on or after, then it won't loop at all, and we'll get that nice benefit of if we've already credited for this month, then we won't add any additional credits. Okay, so let's see how many of these tests break. All of them break. Okay. Which are the interesting ones? Months without credits shouldn't retroactively. So it looks like what happened was, because this is the one we're interested in, the retroactive one. So it was expecting it to generate November 1, December 1, January 1, but what's missing is the February 1. So that means this is before is off, because we already incremented the month. So actually, we want to basically say, in a sense, is on or before. Unfortunately, there is no such thing. We could say is equal to or before, or we could just say is not after. Which, I don't know, isn't the most readable, but let's see how many tests that fixes. Should fix at least 2 or 3. Yep. Okay. So the ones that are passing, so this one that's for retroactive, missing 1 month, and missing 1 month, right? So basically where there was an interest credited and it needs to fill in the gaps, those are now working. The ones that are not working, we'll notice, are because this one is where there was no interest, and we expected that, right? We expected that to fail because the figuring out what is the most recent credit date time, we're doing this get, and that's kind of bad. And so what we want to do here is we want to say get, but if it's null, right, if there were no interest credits, then we want to just find what is the minimum of all transactions. So get, oops. So we can do or else get, which requires supplier, which is kind of weird. So, or else get. I guess we could do transactions stream and then just min. So map to transaction date time and then min. I know this is getting all over the place. Min of local date time compared to okay, do a get here? Yeah, so in a sense, there's an optional here, and the problem is if that's null, right? If there are no transactions, oh, that's an interesting case. So what if there are absolutely no transactions at all? I'd like to guard against that earlier on. Make the assumption here. I mean, it's sort of not going to matter, and we also have cases where hey there, dark theme coder. So that's an interesting thing. What if we don't have any transactions, or what if the current balance is 0? Do we create an interest credit transaction of 0? Right now we are. I don't see a problem with that. That will help us because we won't then go back in time and continue to always calculate 0 interest credit. So I think we'll leave that. So I think having a 0 interest credit transaction is okay. The question is do we even come into this method if there are no transactions? And I would say we want to be sure that there is always a transaction. So, darn it, keep hitting the wrong keys. So we could say or else. What do we want to say? We could say. So, okay. Is it an error if we're basically trying to find the minimum and there is none? I would say yes. And I don't know why did it do that? So that's an optional or else throw, and then we basically just say throw new out of bounds. Index out of bounds exception. We could probably create our own one, but this is basically a good start. Yeah, exceptions are kind of funny. I haven't used or else throw much. What does this do? Returns the contained value of present, otherwise throw an exception by the supplier. Oh, so this needs to be a supplier of exceptions. An example would be great, because I haven't done that. So, whoops. So let's look at, we want or else get and no, or else throw supplier. That should be good enough. So let's look. The docs didn't help us. Let's look at what this says. Or else throw. Oh, it's the actual exception itself. Okay. I don't know why I was thinking imperatively, so I was writing basically a throw, but we don't need the throw. What we need is just the actual exception. Okay. And what is it? Release lambda with the method reference. Sure, I'll do that. This is getting a bit busy here. Let's oops, sorry. Let's extract this. Introduce local variable. That did too much. Because what we want is we want to pull out this or else get part. So let's put that into a variable. Earliest transaction date time. Okay. What's cool is I'm getting a lot of good practice with doing transaction stuff. Sorry, not with doing lambda stuff. Certainly scrolling off. So how about we just do earliest date time? That way we can have this formatted nicer. Okay. All right. So this is possibly a little bit complicated. Actually, I want the better name. So let me do this. So this is earliest any transaction date time. Actually, this is just first transaction date time. And I need to do that as a rename. First transaction date time. Okay. Let's reformat this a little bit. All right. So let's review this. What this is basically saying is find the most recent interest credit date time, right? So we want to get all interest credits, convert them to date time, and then get the max. We're doing this a lot that maybe we want to pull this out into a method, but I don't know. I find the stream stuff so readable that I'm willing to have a bit of duplication here. And so find the most recent one, but it's possible that there are none of these. And it's possible that there are no interest credit transactions, and that's why we have these 3 failing tests. So in that case, we would calculate the first transaction date time. So of all the transactions, find basically the earliest one, which uses min. If that doesn't exist, we're going to throw an exception. So we're basically saying return the most recent transaction. Basically, let's rename this. It's the most recent interest credit transaction, or else we'll get it from the first transaction. And so this is a supplier. This code won't get executed though unless basically this optional is not present. So this is a really good example right here, this method. So this method is a really good example of using a bunch of different things. We're using optional, we're using a supplier, we're combining these 2 things to basically say, on the one hand, find me the most recent interest credit transaction, but if there isn't one, then find the earliest transaction altogether. And if there isn't one of those, throw an exception. So now if we run the tests, I think they will all pass. Close. At least they're not failing. Well, they're not throwing an exception. We are getting comparison failure. Huh. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, this one we might need to change the expectation because of what it's doing. So let's actually go to that one. This was one of the first tests we wrote where basically um, the initial deposit was in 2016. We'll have to change that. And it's assuming we're going to credit only this interest rate, but actually this test is no longer true. So let's make this a bit easier on ourselves. We'll make it 2016 12. So when this crosses over, we need to credit interest for January and February. That's 2 months. So we'll do plus 21. So I'll say for 1, 1 of 17 and 2, 1 of 17. So that's interesting. Okay, so we've got an off by 1 error, right? Because we expected there to be 2. It should have rounded this down and rounded this up. So let's go back to our code. And we're saying the most recent interest credit date time. So let's go back to the test, this one. So here we're saying the first deposit was on 2016 6/7. We create, basically today is February 1st of 2017. This one should generate the missing credits so really this test is trying to do too much. So let's change this so that it's really restricted to 2017. The deposit was made on January 7th. So now let's just run this test. So this test should work. So I think what's happening is it's looking at the first transaction, it's adding 1. Right, so we're basically starting at the wrong point. Right, so most recent interest credit date time, we're basically saying we're going to start there but plus 1 month. So if the most recent credit interest date time, if there's already an interest credited, then we're good. The problem is when we're trying to detect whether okay, so there's an assumption that this is actually the most recent interest credit date time. We add 1 if there was an interest credit date, right? So if we have January 1st already as the last interest credit date, we don't want to start with January 1st, we want to start with February 1st. But if there's only a deposit of, let's say, January 1st, then we want to actually, well, what do we want? If there was a deposit made on January 1st, what do we do? Well, we don't credit for January 1st. That makes no sense because we're going to sort of, we don't have time here, so we can't tell whether the deposit was before or after when we do the interest credit. So we'll basically, if for January 1st, if the January 1st was the first deposit, so given today is February 2nd, 2019, and first transaction was on January 1st of 2019, when we request and only transaction was a deposit, right? So there are basically no interest credits. When we request balance, then we should have interest credit for only February 1, right? Because we don't want one for January 1, and we calculate it monthly, so the next possible one is February 1. And so even if this was the 31st, then this should still be February 1st. So when we find the earliest, okay, so this makes sense. We're basically saying whatever the most recent credit date time is, right? So this one we know we're handling the situation of if there's that. If there isn't, we want to find the transaction date time, the min, and for our test there's actually only one. So we want to return that. So let's go look at this test. So it's February 1st. We have the transaction deposit, the one and only transaction deposited on January 7th. We expect this one to generate the February 1st one. This one shouldn't do anything. And then we expect that there is one that is on this date. So let's debug this test because there's something I'm not seeing. Okay, so we'll step into here. Credit interest is needed. Oops. That's weird. Okay, so we're skipping over something. Let me not set the breakpoint here. Let me set the breakpoint here. And we'll set the breakpoint here. Okay, so let's debug that again. And let me close the project window so we can see better. Okay, let's see what the situation is. The situation is the most recent transaction date time is January 7th. So this is our deposit. We have no interest credits. The last date time for credit is February 1st. So that's, we want to go through this date. Because it started on the 7th, we didn't coerce this one to be the first of the month. So that's what the problem is. So all we have to do is, when we're looping through, we want to be on the first of the month. So we'll do plus months and with day of month 1. So actually this method, I realized what was bothering me about this method. This method should just be first day of current month. So because we don't really need to coerce anything, we just want to say first day of current month. And then we don't need to pass this in. We can just go here, and this is, and then we can delete this. Okay, that feels much better. So now we're saying we're going to start with the first day of the current month, and we're going to loop from this one, which will start with the first day of the month after the most recent transaction date time. And so we can actually refactor this, and we can say first day of month after. What is this saying? This is saying no exact duplicates were found. Extract parameters to reduce duplicates. Oh. I'm going to keep my original signature because I'm not sure what it was getting at. We'll rename this variable to be just date time. As I said, date stuff is hard, even though this was supposedly a fairly straightforward feature, because we weren't worried about sort of weekends or leap years or sequences inside of months. We're still having to coerce. We don't just want a month after the first transaction day. We want the first of the next month. Okay, so first day of, I'm going to rename this because now month. Current's a weird thing because, and I want this sense of this is the system clock now. So now what we're doing is we're iterating basically from the first day of the now month until the first day of the month after the most recent transaction date time. All right. So now let's see what happens if we run all of the interest credit tests. Boom, they all work. All right. What we still have broken though is how it's calculating the interest. We're currently still calculating the interest for even for every time we credit it, we're calculating it with the latest balance, which is wrong. It should be the balance as of that time. So we definitely need to, and that's what I mentioned up here. For interest, we need to fix this. But other than that, we've covered all the other situations. Right, so this test now exists. So here's the retroactive. And this is the one that is just the retroactive. So this is retroactive where no other interest credit transactions have occurred. Okay. So that means there's going to be one more episode tomorrow for finalizing this situation of calculating the balance correctly. And then we can finally say crediting interest is done. But for now, I will say this is episode 10, almost so close to completing interest credit calculation, or just interest crediting. All right. So I will check that in, commit. And push. And that's it for today.